Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program entitled Bazooka Charlie in World War II, His Daughter's Amazing Journey of Discovery. That daughter, of course, being Carol Apaki, tonight's speaker. Carol is a longtime Granville resident, moving here with her husband Ken in 1968 as a newly married couple. She has been actively engaged in community issues and concerns ever since. She is a member of the League of Women Voters of Licking County and is currently engaged in a variety of environmental issues that affect the health and well-being of our community. She has worked at Denison University in the education department and as senior writer for Quest International, a life skills organization promoting the healthy development of young people ages K through 12. She and her husband Ken have 5 children and 13 grandchildren. Now retired, Carol and Ken recently built a solar home and are now happy residents here in the village. Tonight's program, as all of our programs, are sponsored with a generous donation from former Denison University President Dale T. Noble and his wife Tina. Before we begin, I would also like to introduce and/or name members of our programs committee. They are, and raise your hand if you're Greg Dixon, Cookie Sunkel, Nanette Macy-Junes, Lynn Oberholzer, who could make it, and Sam Schneid. And thanks to all of you. So I will turn it over to Carol.
Work on this technology. It's so good to see so many neighbors, friends, family. I feel comfortable. Public speaking is not my forte, but I'm feeling quite comfortable and relaxed. So I hope you enjoy the program. Well, getting started. What started as a late night foray on the internet has evolved into a most wonderful and improbable journey, taking me back more than to World War II and General Patton's 4th Armored Division sweeping through France in the summer, fall, and winter of 1944 and 1945. I discovered a complicated love story about my parents that shaped their lives and mine as well. Tonight I'll be telling you a bit of their story and my adventure in discovering it, and the many surprises and the wonderful people that I met along the way. This discovery started with my response to a few online skeptics about my dad's accomplishments during the war. My response to them led to finding his plane, several YouTube videos, a recently published book, and thanks to Alan Miller and the reporting project, a full-page story in the USA Today newspaper. Alan occasionally joins us for our morning walks that I do at the bioreserve, and one morning I remember telling him about finding my dad's plane and the book, and next thing I know, he came over and wrote an article and that's why, because of Alan, I'm here tonight. I hope you're intrigued because this is what the next hour is about. Let me begin with a short clip of a longer video that was shown last summer at the EAA Air Show. This is an international organization of aviation enthusiasts. Each summer, it puts on the largest air show in the world with more than 800,000 people attending from all over the world. I was invited to participate and talk about my dad and his L-4 plane, Rosie the Rocketer. Here's a portion of the full video that they showed.
Living in Moline, Illinois, 29-year-old Charles Carpenter was a high school history teacher. Carpenter was already a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army Reserve and was called up for duty in March of 1942. He was sent to Miami Beach as an instructor to teach new officers how to be officers. With a younger brother who had been captured by the Japanese in the Philippines, Carpenter did not want to sit the war out in Miami. He volunteered to become a glider pilot and was sent to several bases in the southeast U.S. The glider pipeline was long, and as he was waiting his turn, he volunteered again to become a liaison pilot. He was sent to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where he earned his L-wing and was assigned the 4th Armored Division that was part of General Patton's 3rd Army. He arrived in England in early 1944, and by late May of 44 was assigned Piper L4H, serial number 4330426, which he would later add the nose art Rosie the Rocketer to the front left side in honor of the Rosie the Riveters back home in the States. While in England, he and his fellow pilots tested the use of bazookas that had been attached to the struts of the L4. He was not the first pilot to hang weapons on an L-bird, but he was almost certainly the most effective at using them. Arriving in France on July 27, 1944, he began flying reconnaissance missions for General George Patton's 4th Armored Division. Flying over enemy lines, Charles would report back on the location of enemy tanks ahead of Patton's 3rd Army. It was dangerous work. In June and July 1944, General Omar Bradley's 1st Army, fighting in Normandy, lost 49 spotter aircraft with 33 pilots killed in action. Flying low and slow, unarmed spotter aircraft were vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire and even to small arms fire, and spotter pilots couldn't shoot back. That frustrated Charles Carpenter. In October 1944, alone, Charles Carpenter destroyed 4 enemy tanks and an armored truck with his little spotter plane and earned the nickname Bazooka Charlie. By the end of the war, Carpenter had received 2 Air Medals, 2 Silver Stars, a Bronze Star, and a promotion to Colonel for his bravery, creativity, and determination. He was officially credited with destroying 6 German tanks, making him a tank ace. And the Allied soldiers he fought alongside gave him one more nickname, the Lucky Major.
My adventure with this started about 20 years ago when I called my cousin Jean in New Mexico. I had completely lost touch since I was 12 years old. I just decided I'd call him one day to reconnect. And he was shocked when I called him out of the blue, but we quickly became good friends. And because he knew about my dad and was interested in planes himself, he went to a large air show in Las Vegas, New Mexico, and saw an L4, not my dad's plane, but one just like that my dad flew. He left a note on the owner's plane explaining that his uncle was Charles Carpenter, once known as Bazooka Charlie, and that his daughter lived in Ohio. He left my phone number, and then one day I get a call from Colin Powers, the man who had restored the plane, and he called to say, to tell me that his plane was going to be at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. I brought my daughter and 2 grandchildren to see a plane like their grandfather once flew. Colin's plane had won the International Heritage Award, and he donated it to the Evergreen Air Museum in Oregon. We worked together to create a display about my dad at the museum, and we have been good friends ever since. And then one late night, a few years later, I was casually surfing the internet and decided to type in the name of my dad and Rosie the Rocketer. What popped up from the Great Plains Community Warbirds Forum immediately caught my attention. Hi, I've got a reference I've been curious about. It concerns a Major Charles Carpenter who reportedly went hunting German tanks in the Army's L4 observation plane. Shooting bazookas from a Cub plane would be wildly inaccurate. Well, sorry, but I don't believe it ever happened. Others on the site added their own skeptical comments. I also have my doubts. The complete lack of detail in the story makes me a bit skeptical. Someone else wrote, I'm inclined to dismiss it using a highly technical term, complete bullocks. Boy, by this time it's like 1 o'clock in the morning and I'm irritated. I had never been very interested in my dad's war years, and he never spoke about them. But I remembered the big cardboard box full of letters and photos and newspaper clippings that my mother had saved. And so I opened the box and started to read them. And about 3 a.m, I answered back. And I posted on the site the newspaper clippings full of details about my dad and Rosie. Their response was priceless and hugely satisfying. Well, it looks as if some of us have a trace of hen's ovulation to wipe off our face. But it's well worth it to uncover the real truth of an absolutely amazing story. Welcome to the forum, Carol. Holy living criminy! This is a 5-star thread. Woo-hoo! Never underestimate those damn Yankees. When I told Colin about this experience, Colin, who had restored the original plane, the plane, he suggested that I write an article about my dad and put me in touch with Jim Busha, the publications director at EAA, who offered to publish any article that I would write about my dad based on the letters and the clippings that my mom had saved. The article became a lead story for the EAA War Burns magazine. And then the most amazing thing happened. I got a call out of the blue from a man who introduced himself as Joe Shields. He was a pilot living in Los Angeles and a staff person at the Collins Foundation. He had noticed the serial number on the photo of my dad's plane, and within a short time found my dad's plane Rosie in a museum in Graz, Austria. He casually mentioned my name to his wife, and she said, Carol Akaki, she used to be my brownie leader. Jim and Kathy Hayward had a daughter named Becky. I don't know. Joe wrote me a long letter after finding Rosie. He said, I'm one of the people that works for the Collins Foundation in the effort of creating a living history museum. The photo of your dad really put the hook in me to find out more. His expression connected to me profoundly, and I could not stop thinking about him and the plane. I still feel that the plane was calling me to find her. So Rosie was purchased by the Collins Foundation in October 2017, brought back to the United States to be restored in Oregon by my friend, Colin Powers, who, as it turns out, is well known for his restoration of vintage planes. He preserved the original bullet holes and other battle scars. In fact, I had found a letter in which my dad said, gee, I had a lucky day. I took some fire, knocked over the steeple of a church, but I'm okay. Well, he found those bullet holes in the plane. My daughter, Erin, who is a graphic designer, was asked by Colin to paint the nose art on her grandfather's plane. She did a beautiful job and met the high standards of the museum. I was amazed at how small the plane really is. It's just looks like a toy. After writing the article, Jim Busha, the publications director for the EAA, called me and said, Carol, the story of your dad needs to be more than an article. I'd like to write a book with your help. When Jim came to interview me here in Granville, he assumed I had only a handful of my dad's letters home. He describes what he saw. Scattered across a large dining room table, living room hutch, several end tables, couches and living room floor were hundreds of handwritten letters spanning the years from 1941 to 1965. Photo albums, scrapbooks, newspaper clippings, diaries, and handwritten poetry. To say I was dumbstruck is an understatement. Jim and I worked for about a year on the book. He's an aviation expert. He's also a World War II historian. And while he used my dad's letters extensively to tell the story, he also provides an invaluable historical context and overview of what was happening in the war. He also did a lot of research on the side, actually visiting important places in my parents' lives. The story he wrote is far more than a book about war. It's also a complicated love story. When the book was published in May 2023, we were relieved to read the first review of the book on Amazon from Don Fox, a noted World War II author and historian. He described the book as a magnificent work that he highly recommends because of the character depth and the author's knowledge of World War II and of aviation. So that was such a relief. Because the one thing I told Jim, you can write whatever you discover, but it has to be accurate and true. And he followed that the best he could. Last summer, I was invited to talk about my dad at the EAA Air Show. The book was also presented. A daughter and 4 of my grandchildren came too. And Jim told me that about 30 to 40 people might come to our presentation. Ken counted 400. Well, let me tell you a bit about my dad and my mom, the focus of the book. Both of my parents grew up in poverty with single moms due to alcoholic fathers. My father's father was also a gambler, and he lost his 1,000-acre farm in Illinois in a gambling game. And after that, completely disappeared from my father's life. One of my mother's most searing memories as a child was her dad coming home from heavy drinking and knocking over the Christmas tree. In dealing with her family's dysfunction, my mom developed an anxiety disorder, which the doctor called St. Vitus dance. I'm guessing it was a nervous breakdown. And she dropped out of school in the 9th grade. As a teenager, my dad turned to books for inspiration and guidance, thriving on poetry, the great books, and academic achievement. At 17 years of age, lacking a male role model, he wrote a creed for himself. I resolved to exert all my efforts toward being a nobler and stronger fellow, a gentleman, a scholar, a friend, and a real man. To the best of my ability, I will ever strive to self-control, self-improvement, freedom, wisdom, courage, generosity, truth, and true nobility before gods and men. I will be better. Charles Carpenter, 1929. It's pretty amazing for a 17-year-old. Because of his athletic and academic abilities, my dad got a full scholarship to Center College in Kentucky. And after graduation, he returned to Moline, Illinois, and became a high school history teacher. My mom lived at home with her mother and worked at the local licorice factory. Their lives merged in 1940 when they both attended the Coliseum Ballroom, where young singles came to dance to the big bands of Kay Kaiser Orchestra, Rudy Ballet, and others. They fell deeply in love, and within 3 months they had married, because as my mother told me, we had to get married because we were so in love, neither of us could eat. My dad lovingly referred to my mom as Bunny, and for the first time in her life, I think my mom felt secure, safe, and loved. Neither of them had any idea of how the carnage happening a half a world away would change their lives 17 months later. In 1940, our country created a program to help young men between 18 and 26 learn to fly. While still teaching, my dad received specialized training in aviation ground school, and he did his best to help our nation by becoming a ground instructor. My dad's younger brother, Gene, earned his wings as well, entered the Army, and was soon stationed in the Philippines. Among the letters that I found were several from Gene to his mother, my grandmother. I can't tell you what I'm doing, but I'm still hitting on all 16 cylinders. Had my hair stand on end a couple of times, but if Providence is with me, I'll be home by November this year, or surely next. Keep your fingers crossed and your mind at ease, and it will all be over before you know it. In February 1942, he sent home a long poem he had written, which he called a prayer. The last stanza is especially poignant. The brains are on the rock, the soldiers in the field, MacArthur's miracle men are not about to yield. One last request I have, though I'm not afraid to die, pray God that death don't find me still here on Bataan, PI. I learned that on February 22nd, General MacArthur was told to leave Bataan, leaving behind Gene Carpenter, and 15,000 other brave men who, without adequate food, withstood 11 Japanese attacks over 41 days. They were captured and forced by the Japanese to go on the Bataan Death March. Jean was put on a boat to Japan and died there in a prisoner of war camp. Soon after my grandmother received a Blue Star, my dad headed off to war as well in March 1942, leaving behind my mom, who was pregnant with me, and I was born a few months later. My dad's early letters to my mom were romantic, tender, full of love. He was still in the United States in training and serving as a flight instructor. Dearest, May 31st, 1942, just a few excerpts here. Dearest Bunny, the more I see of life and people here, the more I love my life with you. March 6, 1943. Dearest Bunny, I really am pleased to render service somewhere now. I've been lucky all my life. I have more faith and confidence now than I've ever had. All evil comes to an end, and even more, and the good has a way of smiling through. July 18th, 1943. Sweetheart, I'm one of the luckiest guys in the whole world. One of the best breaks I ever got was when I captured you and later threw you Carol Ann. If my luck doesn't wear out, I'll have you both for a long time. These kinds of letters are typical of the many letters that my dad wrote to my mom. And then in the summer of 1944, they take a darker turn. He was shipped to England, and on July 11, 1944, a month after the Normandy invasion, my dad landed on Utah Beach with General Patton's Third Army and General John Shirley Wood in command of the 4th Armored Division with the motto, "They shall be known by their deeds alone." They immediately entered into fierce combat as they began their sweep through France, pushing the Germans back and liberating towns. My dad flew reconnaissance in a small Piper Cub as a liaison pilot, spotting artillery and scouting the countryside for any trouble. His fabric-covered plane was only 700 pounds. And then at Avranches in France, war correspondent Wes Gallagher detailed when the legend of my dad began.
Not one to just battle in the air, Charles was no stranger to combat on the ground. Near Avranches, Carpenter was scouting landing sites. Spotted by Germans, his unit found themselves under attack. With the US forces battling for their lives, Charles realized the battle was going against them. In a battle rage, he climbed upon a Sherman tank and took control of a 50 caliber machine gun. Taking aim upon the enemy positions, Charles yelled all the while at the American troops to attack and press forward. Led on that day by the Mad Major shouting encouragement upon the Sherman, the Americans won the day and pushed the German forces back. A little too enthusiastically, Charles all the while continued firing, unwittingly striking an American Sherman bulldozer tank. The bulldozer blade of the tank was shot off by Charles, and he was placed under arrest for his perceived recklessness. Threatened with the firing squad, he was in mortal danger for his actions until his commanding officer intervened. Expecting to be court-martialed, in an incredible turn of events, General Patton himself saved Charles. Patton went on to admonish his men for arresting Charles, and instead of punishing him, he awarded the major the Silver Star for bravery, saying that Carpenter was just the kind of fighting man he wanted in his army. The press loved the story of the Mad Major, and his fame grew. He was interviewed and told the reporters, "Some people around here think I'm nuts, but I just believe that if we're going to fight a war, we have to get on with it, 60 minutes an hour and 24 hours a day." By the end of the war, Charles had incredibly knocked out 14 tanks, but was officially credited with 6 tanks destroyed, including 2 of the feared Tiger Is. For his actions, he was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel.
These are all videos of varying degrees of accuracy. But that's why I thought it was important to have a book, so we could discover. As it turns out, it wasn't General Patton, it was General Wood who saved my dad. But I'll get into that a little bit. My dad's letter on August 5th, 1944, took a dramatic and unexpected turn. I can only imagine the shock and the heartbreak that my mother felt as she read it. Dear Elda, brace yourself, because this letter will probably jolt you like hell. At present, I'm in a field medical unit, well and sound, but bearing a tag that says battle fatigue and exhaustion in line of duty. Our advance has been rapid, and events have tumbled upon the other. Someday I'll tell you the whole story. Now I only want to tell you that I shall probably come out of this situation as a common soldier. Frankly, at present, the division authorities don't know what to do with me. I have done nothing that would disgrace my friends, my reputation, or my country. If anything, it is probably overzealousness of mine that has run rampant lately. As things appear from where I stand now, I shall probably not even return home at the end of the war. The old life is pretty much gone for me. Although you and home are as lovely and sweet as ever, from now on I must be free to speak my mind and follow what I believe to be the true course for the most concerned. I shall continue to share with you all that I have. Other than that, much of your own destiny is in your own hands. Many men lose ideals in a war such as this. A few of mine have taken on a new luster. I have seen burning homes in needlessly devastated cities and villages. Amid scenes of confusion and panic, I did what I thought was right. In all cases, I've helped the situation. The individual should no longer count for much when so much else is at stake. I have become a very bad risk as a father and a husband. At times, I am so restless and impatient that I scarcely know myself. Goodbye for now, and a lot of love to you and Carol Ann. Will I be proud of her too someday? Sincerely with love, Charles. Perhaps it was the threat of the court-martial that triggered such a letter. With his character now in question, bruised and battered, he couldn't imagine ever coming home and returning to a normal life. But as you saw in the video, word about my father and what he had done spread like wildfire among the soldiers. And when word got back to General Wood, the commander of the 4th Armored Division, Wood was flabbergasted by what had happened to my dad. And he rescued him by making Dad his personal pilot. It was General Wood, not General Patton, who rescued my dad. Picture coming up.
Not one to just battle in the air.
I'll tell you just a little bit about General Wood because he was such an important man in my dad's life. He served both in World War I and World War II. He's most notably for training and commanding the 4th Armored Division, which spearheaded General Patton's 3rd Army push across France in 1944. He earned the name Tiger Jack because when Patton would yell at him, Wood would pace like a caged animal and argue back. My dad flew General Wood over enemy lines so that he could observe and provide direction to the artillery that followed. Wood shared the hardship of combat with his men, including living in a tent like a common soldier. Known for his outspokenness, he often challenged the decisions of his superiors. In frustration toward the end of the war, General Patton eventually sent General Wood home for rest and recuperation. My dad deeply admired him, as did the men in the 4th Armored Division. My father and General made a good team, except in a 700-pound plane. The two men made up more than half the weight of the plane. My dad was 180 pounds, General Wood was 220. I can only imagine how unwieldy the plane was. When Dad wasn't taking General Wood to the front, he experimented with putting 2 bazookas on his plane, then 4, then 6, and with 3 on each side. An AP reporter, Ken Coyan, wrote what it was like to fly in Rosie with my dad. A flight in Major Charles Carpenter's bazooka shooting Cub observation plane is something like a ride in a roller coaster equipped with skyrockets. My dad said, "My plane isn't maneuverable with 2 people in it." As he flew over the front, he said, "There are 2 German tanks down there." Diving almost vertically to less than 300 yards of the ground, Carpenter fired 2 of the rockets, 1 from each wing. There was a flash of flame. Rosie stuck her nose up in the steep climb. "I allowed too much for the wind," the major grinned. Again, the Cub dived, and 2 rockets flashed groundward to a massive German Panther tank. Black puffs of anti-aircraft shells spotted the sky. And with that, Rosie turned leisurely back to her hillside pasture landing field for another load of gas and rockets. But it was when my dad was flying solo that his legendary deeds continued.
September 1944, the Battle of Araucourt, France. German panzer forces had launched a strong attack against advancing US forces near the city of Nancy, and some units of the 4th Armored Division are pinned down. Taken off in thick fog, Major Charles Carpenter heads for the battle. The fog clears about lunchtime, and Carpenter espies a column of German tanks and vehicles moving on Araucourt. Diving down, he launches his attack. Does Carpenter drop bombs? No. Does he strafe the columns with 50 cals? No. Instead, he fires 6 bazooka rockets at the rumbling Panther tanks before shearing away and heading home to rearm. What were bazookas doing being fired from an aircraft? What the Germans don't realize is their column is being assailed by a man nicknamed Bazooka Charlie, flying not a fearsome beast of aerial warfare, but a slow, fixed undercarriage artillery spotter plane, a Piper Cub grasshopper with the interesting name Rosie the Rocketer emblazoned on its side. Major Charles Carpenter was a pilot serving with the US Army's 1st Bombardment Division in France. His job entailed piloting his L-4H Piper Cub spotter plane on artillery support and reconnaissance missions over German lines. Carpenter did his job well, calling in artillery to support US infantry and armored divisions. But his little plane was unarmed. This began to bother and annoy Carpenter, with constant targets presenting themselves down below and the artillery not always able to hit them quickly enough. Carpenter decided to do something himself. Weaponizing a grasshopper was a tricky business, its low takeoff weight vitally important for short landings and takeoffs in fields within the battle zone. Carpenter decided initially upon a pair of bazooka rocket launchers. The anti-tank weapons were attached to specially designed brackets screwed onto the wing's jury struts. Weapons were loaded and the firing mechanisms wired to a panel in the cockpit so that Carpenter could fire them remotely and in any sequence. Carpenter conducted a series of tests with the pair of bazookas against ground targets, the grasshopper able to swoop down low at extremely slow speed, enabling Carpenter to take aim and fire. The bazookas were angled at 30 degrees, and the rocket's hollow charge warhead could have happily punched through 3 inches or 76 millimeters of armor plate, making many German armored fighting vehicles vulnerable, particularly from flank, rear, or in this case, top bazooka strikes. Carpenter christened his plane Rosie the Rocketer, and increased his armament to 6 bazookas, 3 under each wing. Carpenter now had the means and the will to start dishing out his own brand of trouble. The Mad Major, or Bazooka Charlie as Carpenter was quickly christened, soon found some juicy targets. He would locate a German tank from higher altitude and then descend rapidly, making a short attack run and releasing his bazooka rockets, hopefully on the target. Bazooka Charlie was credited with destroying or immobilizing 4 German tanks, 2 noted as Tiger 1s, and an armored car. In the normal scheme of things, Carpenter's Piper Cub was not shot at by German troops because it would reveal their positions to the enemy. But once Carpenter started rocketing their vehicles, this policy was reversed. The Mad Major faced rifle and machine gun fire as he made his attack runs. The attack he launched on a column of Panther tanks on the 20th of September 1944 was notable for its persistence. After giving the Germans all 6 rockets, he returned to base, reloaded his bazookas, and then flew back to the German column, firing another full load at the enemy armor. Then incredibly, Carpenter returned again, reloaded, and flew back through a storm of lead to rocket the German column for a 3rd time. He received official credit for immobilizing 2 Panthers and several other German armored vehicles.
To add to the story, I found a newspaper clipping that said that there was an American support crew that was trapped under the bridge at Arrocourt, and my dad's attacks forced the remaining German tanks to retreat, enabling the trapped crew to escape injury and capture. But for all the headlines, the poetry my dad was writing showed the deeper pain of war that he was experiencing. One of the few stories that my dad told me was about landing in a field after the artillery had done its damage, getting out of his plane and seeing 4 German soldiers walking toward him, coming out of the woods. My dad thought, well, this is it for me. I'm a dead man. To his utter amazement, the soldiers put up their hands in surrender. Here is an excerpt from a poem he wrote about it. The other day I met one of those we fought in a dark and shattered wood. I had come to see what death our fire had wrought, and face to face we stood. Flames crackled from the wreckage all around. The stench of burning flesh was in the air. His rifle was cast upon the ground, and I, surprised, could only stare. He nodded wearily at my stern command and bent to search his soldier's bag. He tossed aside a knife, a pistol, a shining band, and his face lit up at one small rag. It was a baby thing, blue and partly burned. He folded it and kicked his loaded rifle. I led him from that torn and stinking spot, and willing guards took him to the prison lot. He smiled at me and wrongly guessed me free. And then my dad's letters start to take a new and even darker turn. My poor mom. February 6, 1945. Dearest Bunny, this time I'm writing from an Army evacuation hospital. I've never felt better. However, there is a swelling on one side of my neck that has the doc puzzled. Dad was moved to a hospital in Paris where he had an operation on his neck. He wrote, a growth has been removed from beneath the muscle on the right side of my neck. As you would guess, I'm relatively undisturbed. Further treatment was recommended, and my dad was sent home to Walter Reed General Hospital in the United States. And it was there that he was told by several doctors that he had only 1 year to live with the diagnosis of Hodgkin's disease. April 10th, 1945. Dearest Elda, yesterday almost a dozen of your letters arrived from overseas. They carried your same story of faith in me and in our future. The war may have hardened and corseted me, but the war for me was an absurd and tragic farce. My greatest moments of pity were for the helpless and innocent people ground to bits between our opposing armies. The point is that I have changed more than I let you know. For my part, much of my idealism has slipped through my fingers and disappeared. I have made friends that you would find difficulty in accepting. I have been unfaithful on more than one occasion and thought scarcely anything of it. Money has run through my fingers like dirt. You and Carol have often been little more than a dream of my past and little part of my future. The thought of nothing after death but dreamless sleep is pleasant to me. Perhaps I'm no longer a refuge or a rock to build upon. I'm hungry for the loveliness of you and home, but there's a deeper hunger and pain that I'm sure cannot keep me there. I am no hero, and I dread any appearance in Moline in that role. This letter will probably hurt you more than it should. You have not failed in anything. I am in conflict with life and myself and telling you about it so you may be forewarned and take steps to look out for your own interest as well as our own common interest. What followed are many more letters from various hospitals. He wrote, "It must be hard on you to have my status changing so from day to day. Your voice sounded so fresh and eager yesterday, it must have been on the phone. I wanted to reach across the hundreds of miles and hold you very close." In December 1945, he was still in the hospital, receiving surgeries and treatments, and signing his letters with lots of kisses and goodnights. A week later, he wrote, "My face is badly swollen. I look like I have mumps. The doctor says that if all goes well, I might be able to make it home by Christmas." Even though I was only 3 years old when my dad finally came home, I remember that Christmas well. I remember I was surrounded by Christmas gifts and I was ripping through them and hooting and hollering and probably acting like a spoiled brat. And I remember my dad couldn't stand it. He stormed out of the room. I think after seeing so much suffering in France, it was just unbearable to see the contrast. I didn't like him all that much when he came home. He was quite stern and remote, unlike my gentle, loving mother who had given me her sole attention. Now with my dad home, not so much. I probably saw my dad as an intruder. Our early years together were shaky at best. With the diagnosis of Hodgkin's confirmed and given about a year to live, my dad decided he was going to enjoy this year. He wanted to see the American West, and so we rented out our home in Moline, bought an Airstream trailer, and headed out west for several months, visiting friends and family along the way. As I read the letters that I know caused my mother so much pain and made for such a heartbreaking time for both of them, I'm quickly reminded that the story has a happy ending. After several months of travel, we headed back to Illinois to prepare for death. But he was feeling fine and beginning to heal, and so did their marriage. They bought an old brick house near the University of Illinois campus in Champaign, Illinois, so that someday I could easily and affordably go to college. Not sure about what to do next, my dad got his master's and was still feeling fine and began to heal emotionally. He took a job teaching history at a nearby high school, thinking it might be very short term. We lived from year to year. Each year at Christmas time, my dad had surgery to remove another inflamed lymph node, but he always recovered. And for the rest of the year, he lived an active, satisfying life and continued teaching history for 25 years. Even though the dark shadows of death hung over us, I was able to grow up with two loving parents. I realize now that it was my mom who held our little family together. Even though she was shy and retiring, she had a fierceness of spirit that often shined through. To educate herself, she got her high school degree through correspondence school, often with my dad at her side, guiding her through algebra problems. He also helped me through algebra. My mom loved to dance and make fun. And when I was a child, she read to me from the Book of Knowledge to instill a curiosity in me that is with me still. And while she lacked the intellect of my dad, she brimmed with common sense and a non-judgmental, generous spirit. My dad was a deeply respected high school teacher who taught history, and he often had the school yearbook dedicated to him. The image of my dad as Bazooka Charlie is one that is very different from the person I knew. I knew him as a scholar. He read widely, collected great books, loved and sang operetta in the shower, and carried on serious discussions about philosophy and history. He was a poet, a practical joker, an athlete, and a gentle husband and father who patiently taught me chess, tennis, and regularly took me on nature walks and camping and canoe trips. He spent long hours with me in deep conversations about books and big ideas. One of his commitments, he did not want me to be a sissy. So he was always pushing me to hold the snake. I have a picture of me at 10 holding up a long snake, and he got the picture and then I fainted. I remember climbing up to the highest jumping and diving board at the local swimming pool, probably 20 feet high. My dad waiting for me below, and I'm peering over, not wanting to jump, and he yelled at me, "Jump, damn it, jump!" And I still jumped. But he was determined to push me to my limits. In the summers, my dad ran a boys' camp in the Ozarks, a camp that focused on teaching outdoor skills and building character. The counselors who served with him at the camp are now in their late 70s, early 80s. They are now writing a book about him and the profound influence he had on them as young men who strive to live by the high standards that my dad once had written down in his creed. One of these counselors, a former college professor now in his 80s, told me that he keeps my dad's picture on his desk and he looks at it every day as an important role model in his life. I think what I'm really trying to say is that his war deeds as Bazooka Charlie with Rosie the Rocketer were only a small part of who he was and the legacy he left. My dad died in March 1966. I had just returned from the Peace Corps, and my father fell on the basketball court while playing a vigorous game, and his health took a dip, and Hodgkin's disease finally won out. My mother and I spent the last 2 months visiting him in the hospital. I had long, loving conversations with him, still seeking his insights and advice. Sadly, I never asked him about his war years. One day, he took a turn for the worse and, in true style, died with a book of poetry on his chest. High school students at the Urbana High School wrote a tribute to him in the yearbook, writing, "It is perhaps impossible to do Mr. Carpenter justice. He was a war hero who never spoke of the war, a rugged athlete who also wrote poetry, a gentleman who spoke with tolerance and wisdom. This he was, and more." After my dad died, my mom became a Christian Scientist and learned how to overcome her insecurities and health issues. She took some college courses in early childhood development, and later she moved here to Granville to be closer to me and our family. She worked as a teacher's assistant at Montessori School in Newark and well into her 80s. She studied every morning the teachings of Mary Baker Eddy and didn't go to a doctor ever again. On the day before she died at age 88, my daughter Mary Kay and I went to see her with Mary Kay's 2 small children. My mother held the youngest, chatted happily with us, and served us summer strawberries. As she stood on the porch and waved goodbye, I said to my daughter, "Doesn't Grandma look beautiful?" The next morning, I found her lying on her bedroom floor. She passed away on my father's birthday. I like to picture my father coming for her with outstretched hand and saying, "Bunny, it's time to come home." There were still some strawberries left in the refrigerator and the boxes about my dad's war years in her closet. So in closure, this has been an amazing journey for me and a gift at this stage of my life to be able to put together and make sense of all the bits and pieces of memories, photos, and newspaper clippings, all of which my mother lovingly saved. And now I can actually go to see his plane on display at the Collings Foundation in Hudson, Massachusetts. And I have a wonderful book that completes the puzzle and puts all the pieces together. So what have I learned from all of this? Well, I learned that heroes come in many forms. My dad left the military as a lieutenant colonel with many medals to acknowledge his brave deeds. But I realized that it was my mom who was as much a hero as my dad. In fact, it was my mom who held things together as my dad was falling apart. I'm guessing he had PTSD, a condition that was not addressed in World War II. And like many women during wartime, she carried on. and I grew up with a father. I also learned that our parents have much more interesting lives than we ever dreamed. And if you don't ask them, you probably will never know about it. I'm sure most of you have had a parent or a grandparent who served in World War II with a story to tell. The only reason I'm here tonight is because my mom so carefully saved so many pieces that made this story possible. But most of all, my own children and grandchildren now know this story about my parents and have seen close up how even the best of lives can be full of ups and downs, sadness and regret, but that people can recover. Heartbreaking things can happen and mistakes are made, but love and forgiveness can prevail and lead to happy endings with inspiring stories to share with your family and friends, and now with all of you. Thank you.
Can you take a couple questions?
So did your mother, do you have any of your mother's letters to him?
So many people have asked that. She is asking, do I have any of my mother's letters? No, because my dad was receiving these letters in wartime, and I'm sure, he didn't carry them. He couldn't keep them. And that would be the missing piece, to have those letters back. But I can almost imagine what my mother's letters were. I think she ignored my dad's ups and downs and just continued to write loving responses to him. And that kept the marriage together. My dad really needed her, and when he came home with Hodgkin's, she was prepared to take care of him with open arms.
Who created the videos? How did that happen?
Well, after some stories started to come out with the book, all of a sudden I went online one night at YouTube, and there's like 8 or 9 animated videos, some of these things. And I thought, well, rather than try to tell you, I'll just take clips. My granddaughter, fortunately, was here, and she knew how to clip videos. And so she put this together for me. I'm just amazed. If you type in my dad's name, there's hundreds of I still am puzzled as to why there's still so much interest in somebody in World War II. There's so many heroes of World War II. But I think what my dad did was somewhat unique. And people love heroes. They're looking. So that's why I thought it was so important to make sure that what we were telling, both the warts and the heroic deeds my dad did. I mean, he really, when I'm reading if you've read the book, some of you, you're going, oh my God, get it together, man. But my mom was the one who held it together.
It must have been very frustrating to be on this side of the water for all those years, training. Not waiting to get over here, and that was until 44.
Yeah, she said that it must have been so frustrating to be on this side of the ocean, but they were preparing these pilots and my dad was a wonderful instructor, and so they needed him. He started in glider school, and then they switched him over to something else, and he was instructing. So he was instructing a lot of pilots, so they needed him here as an instructor in the United States, from the way I understand it. Yeah.
Carol, you may have known, and maybe you knew all of these warts as you described them, but I'm guessing that there were some that were revealed to you as you did your research, looking through the boxes of letters and so forth. And I'm curious how you felt about that when you read about these very dark days that your dad was experiencing.
I was stunned to see it because, as you can guess, I saw my dad as this noble, heroic man, and to see him talking about being unfaithful to my mother, being very critical of who I thought were heroes. General Patton was someone he was somewhat critical of. he spouted off when he shouldn't have. So it's not a perfect picture, and and I told Jim, as long as it's true, you can put it in the book. The irony, just as a twist of it's almost like a Hollywood movie, when my mother was living here, probably 85 years old, she receives a letter from the Granville post office, and she called me over because to see it. It was a letter that had fallen into a slot somewhere, probably at one of the hospitals here in Chicago or wherever he had been. And when they tore down the post office, they found this letter. And the letter was to another woman. The twist of it, the things that we do that we think will never be done, found out. As it turns out, this was, it's wartime. I understand, I really do. But you can imagine how heartbreaking it was for my mom. And she was determined to see if she could deliver this letter to the person that was. And I said, Mom, let it go. They had a long and loving marriage, and it was a brief, but just the twist of that. Yeah.
I read this book very quickly. And all I came out of that was, I hope I live long enough to see the movie.
Dick Van Meter says he hopes he lives long enough to see the movie. Yeah, it has a bit of everything. And I debated a long time when Jim Busha approached me about writing a book, because I knew there were, warts in the story. Should I reveal this? Your parents' lives opened up to Granville and other places in the world, and I debated. But I think it's a story, how I rationalize it was that this is a story of wartime. I think it's a story that many soldiers, when they come back to fit into the United States, their children don't know them, their wives are, a mess. It's a typical story, and I think it needs to be told. It's told with love. And I think, so that's, on that basis, I think it needs to be told. And when I was interviewed at the EAA Air Show, I had veterans from the Vietnam War, other wars coming up to me and saying in tears how much this book meant to them. Because I think it captures what happens in war. And families, the heroes are at home as well as overseas. Yeah.
What is EAA?
The EAA is the
Experimental
Experimental
Aviation Association.
Oh,
Yeah, it's a big, it's the most amazing thing I've ever dreamed of. It's in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. Planes are coming in from all over the world. It's workshops and all demonstrations and big planes and little. And my dad's plane was going to be displayed there, but at the last minute they had an emergency at the Collins Foundation and the plane couldn't come. But it's an amazing show, and 800,000 people last summer, and it's done every year. Yeah.
So did he ever fly after the war?
Never did it yet.
No.
Never did. Partly he was a history teacher and didn't have much money. So, a high school history teacher. Well, thank you for your interest and attentive ear. Oh, yeah, David.
Did he ever receive any recognition from Center College?
I don't think so, no. But one day I was out in my yard and some people came through and they acted like they knew me. And so I had to pretend I knew them because it was so embarrassing. And they were interested in coming in and seeing the house. And they're chatting away. And finally I said, I don't know you. And they realized, they thought I was Evelyn. And he was the president of Center College. And when I told him about my dad being there, going there, of course, he wanted to go back and then, celebrate the story back at Center College. So that's all I know. Thank you.
Another round. Well, if you haven't read the book and you want to read it, our new partner in back, Kim Keith-Ball of Reader's Garden Bookstore, has some copies back there. So-
And it will tell you all about, on the back flap, the EAA information. So all the good things we've heard about are in here.
Okay. Okay, a couple other things to mention. Our next program will be Wednesday, April 17th, entitled Exploring Ohio Canals at 7 p.m. here in the Robinson Research Center. Our speaker will be author Sarah Harper of Have Books Will Travel, who will discuss how Licking County's canal system fit into the state's canal network. Also, you may have noticed several works of art hanging here in the Robinson Research Center. Marilyn Young, many of you know her, a longtime volunteer and supporter of the Historical Society, has donated a number of her late husband's work to the Historical Society, which will be sold for the benefit of the Society's programs and operations. Her late husband was Michael Young, who graduated from Denison and later returned to teach in the art department for 35 years, retiring in 2002. The exhibition on view here is a selection of the works that will be auctioned through Apple Tree Auction Center sometime in June. Watch for the details about that event. There's some very interesting stuff, as you can see. So, in addition to all of these works, the Society is keeping two for our collection. So, again, thank you for being here this evening. Carol, it was amazing, and you were all amazing being here. Thank you.